So this is a lesson on the left-hand thumb, and this is a Q&A question. So last week on my email newsletter, which I put out once a week, I asked people to send me their questions or suggestions for lessons, and this one was from Paul. And he said, I would like to know how the left-hand thumb performs on the back of the neck of the guitar while playing scales. Does it traverse across the neck while the fingers maintain their curvature, or is it static while the fingers curl more tightly and the wrist drops down so as to remain straight? All lessons that I can find only show the fingers in action from a front perspective. So thanks, Paul, and we might as well expand this beyond just scales and just talk about the left-hand thumb in general. So what I'll do is I'll give you a little lesson from this perspective, from the camera in front of me there, and then I think I'll take the camera and I'll put it behind so you can see what the thumb would look like from the player's perspective. So what it might look like if you were looking down at your left hand. So the first thing I want to say is that there's some general rules that I would put out to beginners, and I don't know, whoever's watching this, maybe you're a beginner, maybe you're an intermediate player, maybe you're an advanced player, who knows. So I'm going to start by saying some general things that I would mention to beginners, because I think that's really important to kind of have a really basic idea of what you should be doing, and then we can talk about some subtleties as we move on. So a basic idea, and what I tell my beginner students, is the first thing is that from a horizontal position, the thumb should be behind the second finger. So if I'm playing a scale and I move my hand away, you can see my thumb is behind that second finger. And that also is true for shifts. So you can see that the thumb is behind the second finger. So when you do a shift, the arm just moves that hand up and the thumb stays behind the second finger the whole time. So from a horizontal perspective, the thumb should never lag behind. Like, the biggest problem for students is that when they shift, their fingers go this way and their thumb kind of lags behind, and then they end up playing kind of like this, but they're all destabilized. Instead, the arm should just move the hand around in many subtle ways, but the thumb just remains in the same place. So the thumb is always just behind that second finger, no matter what. Now, in terms of the vertical position of the thumb, whether the thumb follows the hand down through the scales, is a trickier question. Let's start off with a basic exercise. So going to the 5th fret, doing one finger per fret. When I teach beginners this exercise, I actually suggest that their thumb moves down with their fingers. So if it's up on the 6th string, it would be there. And then if it is moving down towards the 1st string, it would be more there. The reason I do this with beginners is I want them to kind of learn this kind of circled shaped left hand, this idea of curved fingers. I don't want to suggest that when they play on the 1st string that their hand end up looking like this. I want their hand to look like this. Now, if we expand, and that's also true of scales, as they move up, I'm kind of suggesting that their thumb move with their hand so they keep some of that curvature and they're never in like a negative angle. But as we know, when we're playing more difficult pieces, it's more complicated than that. Like, what if you're doing something like a piece of counterpoint or an exercise from pumping nylon? Clearly, the thumb can't be in two places at once, so there has to be a compromise. It has to stay in the middle of the back of the neck, and the fingers have to do all the movements. That's probably also true if you're going fast in your scales. If you're going fast, you don't really have time to like inch the thumb down with the hand. Maybe you do if you're like super relaxed, you can just like let the thumb move. But I think in general, the more difficult the piece that you're playing, the more intricate and more movements that are involved, the thumb is going to remain pretty static behind the neck, and the fingers are going to do all the different movements. But remember, it's very subtle. Like the amount of movement that you're actually doing should be small. There's never any big arm movements. So beginner players have a tendency when they're playing things like this to be like, moving their arm around in their hand. And so the movements are not very subtle. And when the movements are not very subtle, then their thumb position is kind of all over the place. A professional who might be, or a more advanced player, might be able to do much more subtle movements. Just a little tiny movement of the finger like this, and which really doesn't require an arm position change or a hand position change. So even when the reach gets kind of extreme, because the fingers are doing all the work, the thumb and the whole arm movement doesn't really come into play. It's all very subtle. So in that case, your thumb would remain pretty static. So my advice is this: in general, in your repertoire, unless you're doing something very specific, your thumb will remain probably in the back of the guitar neck, just somewhere in the middle like that. And you'll do some very subtle movement with your wrist to keep curvature in those fingers. That's my general comment. This is going to change if we're doing something like a very specific bar shape or something like that. Sometimes my thumb is way at the bottom here because I need that extra room for the bar. So my thumb would be almost on just on the bottom of the neck. Or if I'm doing some kind of crazy stretch, sometimes my thumb will be almost coming over, right? If it was something very irregular. So there's definitely situations where your thumb's really going to move. If I was doing jazz shapes, sometimes my thumb would be up higher. But again, that's irregular and not part of the classical guitar technique. So again, my advice is that in technique practice, you can probably move your thumb along with your hand if you're working on keeping a nice curvature in the fingers. And if you're playing repertoire and more complex repertoire, you probably have to keep it in the back of the neck, relatively static. It can move a little bit based on what you're doing, but very subtle movements, very small, subtle movements, and not much movement at all. So let me take the camera now, and I'll switch it to this angle, and I'll play some scales, and I'll play a couple of little excerpts from pieces, and you can just watch my thumb from the other side. So this is a little bit of an awkward view because the camera is right where my head wants to be, but nevertheless, let me just go through a couple of things. So the first thing is just about the horizontal position of the thumb. So if I'm doing a scale with a shift, that second finger and the thumb just move along the guitar like this. In other words, the hand or the arm just moves the whole hand position around. So this kind of hand position just gets transferred around the guitar neck. Now, like I said, when I'm teaching beginners an exercise, because I want perfect curvature of all the fingers, I have them move the thumb down the neck when they play on the first string, or up here when they're playing the low string. Now, if you're playing faster though, and when you're playing scales, it's not very practical to move the thumb while you're playing because there's just so much reach. Also, when you're playing any kind of counterpoint, the thumb doesn't really have time to move around all over the place, so it has to be pretty static. That's not to say that when you're playing scales that you couldn't move the thumb down. If your thumb's relaxed, you can just kind of let it drift downward a little bit, but in general, it'll stay more static. And again, though, the subtleties of movement, though, are so slim. If I'm playing up here, I can bring my wrist forward a little bit. Gives me lots of reach there. And then when I go down to here, if I just bring this back a little bit, then I can still reach that upper string without moving my thumb too much. So there's some subtleties of movements this way, right, that help with the reach of here and down here. So when I say there's no movement in the thumb, that's not entirely true. Although my thumb has remained static here, you can see the position of my hand in relationship to my thumb has changed a little bit. So there's lots of subtleties involved, but when you're starting out, I would keep it just, focus more on the curvature of your fingers and make sure that you understand how to play good notes. And then as you progress into faster scales or scales with shifts, you can start keeping that thumb a little bit more static and a little bit, just make the movements more subtle. So there's a lot more subtlety to what you're doing and the movement's small. So I hope that helped a little bit. Maybe it was a little bit, I can't give you like a direct answer because it depends on the situation. But for scales anyway, in general your thumb will remain static, although there'll be some movement in the wrist as well. In the end, just don't forget that it's probably a combination of all the different things I said. So there's like a little bit of pivoting, a little bit of staying static, a little bit of movement at certain times, especially if you get up into really higher upper positions. There's always going to be these subtleties.